Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope you've enjoyed the day. The final session of the day, it's a great welcome to my boss, Minister for the Cabinet Office and the Civil Service, Francis Maude. He's rare in a minister. He's a minister with previous, right? Don't get that wrong. He's one of the few ministers in the coalition government that's actually done the job before, and we worked together in the Treasury long time ago very effectively. I know that the Minister is someone who cares passionately about the civil service and has done a lot to help us. He's also done a lot to shake us up and has been a scourge of consultancy spending, marketing spending, and being clear about driving very passionately the efficiency agenda. So you want to listen to him, not me. More ado. Francis.
Gus, thanks very much. Gus and I go back quite a long way, as he suggested. Actually, the first time I met Gus, you've probably forgotten this, we both used to go to the gym in the House of Commons. And as you can probably see from our relative shapes, he's continued to go to the gym since. And then I was moved to the Treasury to become a Treasury Minister, and I discovered this. I barely recognized him with his clothes on, actually. But I discovered who it was. So it's a pleasure working. I always love it when he describes me as his boss. Of course, it's complete nonsense, but it makes me feel good. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to have the chance to talk to you all today at this Civil Service Live event. I'm told it's lots going on, and it's very upbeat and buoyant, which is great. And I'll try and make sure this isn't the moment where it turns pear-shaped. It's great to be asked to talk here. And I've talked to groups of civil servants a lot, and I like doing it. I love my role as Minister for the Civil Service. In the kind of scheme of things of ambitious politicians wanting jobs that give them headlines and excitement and exposure, probably being Minister responsible for the civil service kind of doesn't get up there much at the time in terms of the glamour and the excitement, but I love it. And I regard it as a huge privilege to have this role. As Gus has said, I have previous. And I lost my seat in Parliament in 1992 and left government at that point, and then embarked on the longest sabbatical in political history. And came back to it after that break. And one of the delights was to work again with civil servants and to experience again that dedication, the commitment, that very strong ethos of public service which animates most civil servants. And in truth, we tend to take our civil service for granted a bit. It's so much part of our society, the basic workings of our country. It's easy actually for us to go about our daily business hardly noticing it. But that would be a huge mistake. And you'll have heard me say before how much government, not just this government, all governments actually value the civil service. And this time last year at this event, David Cameron told you how grateful he was for the calm, practical support that he and Nick Clegg got from officials, particularly in the Cabinet Office, but elsewhere as well, as they put together the coalition government and the programme for government. We've all got used to hearing the British civil service described as a Rolls-Royce machine, as the jewel in the constitutional crown. The words of the Northcote-Trevelyan Report in 1854, which for the first time codified the principles underlying the civil service: permanence, political impartiality, meritocracy. They're quoted in speech after speech, and the service is routinely praised for continuing to live up to these values. And I agree with all of that. I've said it myself many times, and I mean it. I really mean it. The civil service really is one of the jewels in our constitution. But we all know that to stay the best, the service can't rest on its laurels. Last autumn, more than 325,000 civil servants took the time to fill in the People Survey, our annual staff survey, one of the really important innovations that Gus brought in. We did debate whether to continue with it, but we absolutely took the view that this was a valuable tool. I mean, it's kind of holding the mirror up to ourselves and to see what we do, Do we do it well? What do people who we ask to turn up to work day after day to do difficult things, how do they feel about their job and how it operates? One of its most striking findings was that although in general you enjoy your actual work, you like your colleagues and your immediate line managers, you're unhappy with what the survey terms leadership and managing change. In other words, how the civil service is run strategically. Nor especially amongst more junior grades and the biggest delivery organizations did we score well on employee engagement. Faced with the propositions, I'm proud to tell others I'm part of whatever the organization is, and the proposition, my organization inspires me to do the best in my job, you often tick the box marked neither agree nor disagree. And I don't think this is just because civil servants are worried about pay, pensions, and job security, although these are very real concerns, which I'll come to in just a moment. I think there's been quite a lot of dissatisfaction within the civil service for quite a long time, and I think its cause is more fundamental than that. Too often, good management is constrained by people's terms and conditions, which can be very limiting. I was told the other day that the government had paid more than £100,000 to exit someone who wasn't performing up to the right standard. And this can't make sense, actually. We shouldn't be paying poor performers to leave at a time when we're constrained in how we can reward our top performers. It's reflected in the fact that 26% in the People survey had disagreed with the statement, poor performance in my team is dealt with effectively. And I'm going to say a bit more a bit later on about the issue of performance management, both in the good sense and in the more difficult sense, because I think it is an issue that is beginning to be addressed, but we need to go further. For decades now, governments have been promising civil service reform, and there have been many such reforms. Back in 1968, Lord Fulton recommended, in a very wide-ranging report, recommended that management skills be valued more highly. He recommended that the fast-stream recruitment net should be spread beyond Oxbridge and the public schools. The second did happen, although not very quickly. The first arguably hasn't happened enough, and I'll say more about that a bit later on. 20 years later, Sir Robin Ibbs, in his Next Steps report, he wanted to see the service decentralized, made more accountable and more commercially minded, and there were a number of ways in which that happened with the Next Steps agencies, executive agencies, but I'll say a little more about that part of it also. Some of those recommendations were implemented, not all. But too often, I think, in my conversations, I find civil servants talk about how frustrated they are by bureaucracy and red tape, by numerous layers of management, and by a culture that tends to value the generalist still over the specialist and tends to value process over outcome. Caution too often trumps innovation. The tried and tested is preferred to the bright idea that carries some risk and might just fail. Talented people can feel unappreciated and become bored and disillusioned. 30 years ago, an MOD research scientist, when interviewed, said the weight of the organization above her felt like a block of cement on her head. Some of you today, I suspect, might say much the same. This time around, we need to try to lift that block of cement and give people more freedom, encouragement to be liberated and to give full vent to their talents and energies. And I don't think that's just about a bit of reorganization and renaming. I don't think it's about a few fast-forgotten initiatives and snappy PowerPoint presentations. I think we need a civil service genuinely transformed, which will be smaller for sure, that's already happening, but more dynamic, more innovative, more agile, and more open. A workplace where good ideas get heard and acted on, where every employee, every member of staff can reach his or her full potential. The good, the objectivity, the honesty, the integrity, the impartiality we must honour and keep. The bad, the perhaps sluggishness, rigidity, insularity that is a feature of too much of government must go. In the spending challenge, which we launched around this time last year, indeed, I remember a stall at Civil Service Live where we encouraged civil servants to put forward their ideas. It demonstrated that workers in the public sector, whether they were nurses, teachers, civil servants, local government workers, care passionately about improving the way public services are delivered and often have the most ambitious ideas about how they can be improved. In total, around 65, in fact more than 60,000 public servants suggested reforms as part of the spending review, asked to suggest ways in which money could be saved without damaging frontline services. And there were 60,000 or more ideas, and most of them serious, practical, actionable ideas, which we picked up and I hope are being implemented. It was stunning the extent to which people wanted to contribute seriously to improving the way in which services were delivered and to help save money without damaging the services, which they came into the public service to deliver. Lots of suggestions, whether it was identifying low-value regulations that could be removed or coming up with innovative ideas to improve a service at a local level. It's clear that far from being reluctant to change, the people at the coalface who are delivering frontline public services, they're the people who are most keen to embrace new ways of working, to respond to the needs of the people they're there to serve. I saw this recently myself when I visited Newcastle, where I visited the tax office, revenue office there, where they've really embraced lean process methodologies, driving up to a startling extent, driving up productivity and service quality. And the staff I met there were motivated, were highly engaged, fully committed to the idea of continuous improvement. Because I think we now, that no good organization in the world believes that you achieve a steady state where you keep going on the same basis. Organizations are always either getting better or they're getting worse. And unless you embrace continuous improvement, then the certainty is that your organization will, in productivity terms, be going backwards. And it was a great example there in that huge Newcastle revenue office of how local innovation beats the old preference for central planning, for top-down command and control. And it's one of the reasons why we're so determined to devolve power away from Whitehall. Let me tell you how we're going to go about this and the reforms. First, the context. Well, as you know, the government's having to make cuts in spending. Sometimes people say, in fact, the Archbishop of Canterbury said recently that the big society is just a cover for cuts. Well, my response is it's not a very good cover for cuts. It's not covering anything up. We're being very open about the fact that there have to be reductions in spending. When we formed the coalition government just over a year ago, we were faced with the biggest budget deficit that the country has seen since the war. Our structural deficit was nearly 9% of GDP. Relative to the size of our economy, it's worse than Ireland's and it's as bad as in Greece. For every £3 the government was collecting in revenue, it was spending £4. Total debt was growing by more than £400 million a day. Total debt growing by £400 million a day. And we couldn't go on like that. No country could. We had to get our finances back on track. We've raised some taxes, but most of all, we've had to embark on a reduction in spending. One of my first moves when I came to the Cabinet Office a year ago, 14 months ago now, was to start cutting central overhead, the overhead costs. We opened renegotiations with our biggest suppliers. We put in place a Whitehall-wide moratorium on all new consultancy contracts. I've found that there was a bit of a tendency to default into a sort of comfort zone when there were difficult things to do. You reach for the consultancy contract, hire consultants, and that's not only very expensive, but actually it's quite demotivating for civil servants. Good civil servants like being given difficult things to do. We all do. That's what stretches us, develops us, excites us, keeps us energized and stimulated. And we've cut the spend on consultants very dramatically over the last year. We put in place a moratorium on government advertising programs, and that's fallen by more than 60%. All of these now have to be signed off centrally, in many cases signed off personally by me. And these measures are saving lots of money. We put in place controls over property. Again, no new lease should be signed or break point in any lease passed without my personal sign-off. Between all of these controls that we put in place, which squeeze overhead costs, we saved between £3 and £4 billion just in that first short financial year that ended at the end of March. And we can continue with that to drive down cost in the overhead. And of course, the benefit of that is that it protects, to the greatest extent we can, jobs, and it protects frontline services. But of course, headcount in the civil service is also reducing, and it's down by 17,000 people out of about 500,000 in total. Nearly all, I'm glad to say, via natural wastage. I hate that phrase, natural wastage. People leaving is what it means. And voluntary redundancy. But even though these savings have been made mainly through, as I say, people leaving and voluntary redundancy, it is painful, and it will continue to be so for some time to come. Managers hate telling people that there's no longer a job for them. It's one of the most difficult things you ever have to do. And if you're on the receiving end, it's pretty hard not to take it personally. I've been through it myself. In the 1992 election, the electors said it to me, liberated me, thought it was time for a change of career. In my head, I knew that it was, I thought, more to do with the flow of the electoral tide than directed at me personally, I think. But it was a shattering blow nonetheless. I know what it's like. And yes, we've frozen pay as well. Not popular, I know, but necessary if we would have the best chance of preserving as many jobs as we could. There's some fairly simple arithmetic. The greater the cost per job, the fewer jobs we can afford. In the recession, hundreds of thousands of people in the private sector took actual pay cuts, as well as having their pensions massively reformed. There were actual pay cuts. It was the best chance, they judged, to keep their employer in business and their jobs intact. And we're also, as you know, reforming public sector pensions. And this is not, I stress, about a race to the bottom. Lord Hutton, in his report to us, which we got in March of this year, stressed that it should not be. We wanted public sector pensions to continue to be among the very best available. So that's why we committed on day one to keeping defined benefit schemes with a guaranteed and index-linked level of pension. These schemes, as you'll know, have all but disappeared from the private sector. Public sector pension schemes will still be among the very best available. And the benefits that you've already accrued, you'll keep, meaning that those nearing retirement will see very little change. But people will work for longer, with retirement age ultimately aligning with the state pension age, because they're living longer. It's a better balance between life spent in work and life spent in retirement. And we'll ask people to pay more as well, so there's a better balance between what members of staff pay and what other taxpayers pay. And this is about the schemes being affordable for the future, sustainable for the future, as being still among the very best schemes available, with most people, certainly on middle and lower incomes, continuing to retire on a pension which is at least as good as what they expect to retire on at the moment, in many cases better, but drawing the pension later and paying some more towards it. And most people, I think, accept that this isn't such a bad outcome. They realize there's a basic fairness to it. The old system was unsustainable and out of kilter. The cost to the exchequer had risen by a third over the last 10 years. We've got discussions still going on with the TUC and the public sector unions, and it was therefore, I believe, premature for some people to go on strike last week. I'd like to thank the 8 out of 10 civil servants who ignored the pickets and turned up for work last Thursday. Well, our reforms for the civil service aren't just about cutting costs. It's important that we do cut costs, and it's vital. But it's not all that this is about by any means. As I said earlier, my ambition is for the civil service to come out of the spending review period in 2015 looking radically different, a modern service for a modern world. First, it will be smaller. The central Whitehall civil service in those few central London postcodes should be much smaller. And some of this is simply about having leaner head offices. But it's also a recognition that we don't need to have so many people within those central London postcodes. At the moment, we have roughly 80,000. We should be able to manage in central London with the numbers that will fit into the core Whitehall freehold estate, which, after sorting out the properties, the rest of the properties that haven't been refurbished, should be around 45,000. And that'll enable us to get out of many hugely expensive leasehold properties as well. This is a work in progress, but we've started, and already you can see the Cabinet Office sharing space with the Treasury in one Horse Guards. And if we occasionally in the Cabinet Office get to use some of the meeting rooms, that would be good too. Treasury tend to go in for block bookings. Anyway, so there's not the place to ventilate that issue. Second, the civil service should in future be flatter. At present, the typical departmental organogram would do the Chinese imperial court proud. Management structures need to be less hierarchical, more streamlined, with reporting lines much shorter. A recent review of the Department for Business recommended that its layers of management should be cut to 7. Well, still sounds to me like too many. I know we're not a supermarket, but I'm told that Tesco has 5 layers from chief executive officer to the checkout operator. We can run big organizations with a much flatter structure, much less hierarchical, and we need to in future. Third, the civil service needs to be more integrated and more fluid. People should be able to move around within the civil service more easily. In theory, the senior civil service is a centrally managed resource, but in reality, it isn't for most of it. Talent isn't always matched to where it can best be used. And it seems to me that the fast-stream graduate entry should be centrally managed as well. So they would expect in their first induction and training years to move around much more. The graduate entry into many other professional services organizations would typically have 4 6-month postings with a range of different experiences and challenges. And this would not only equip fast streamers better for the variety of challenges that will lie ahead of them, but it would also gradually build new cohorts into the system who have a common ethos and a common experience that would help over time to bind the civil service more closely together. Fourth, we need a change in our culture. And this is the most difficult thing to do, but actually it's the thing that will deliver most as well. We need a culture that's pacier, that's less paper-driven, less imprisoned by process, more entrepreneurial, more innovative, less risk-averse. As I say, easy to say, plenty of people have stood at podiums like this before and said it, really difficult to make it happen. And I stress this is not just about how civil servants behave, it's about the expectations that ministers have, it's about the requirements of Parliament, it's about the demands of the media. And these all may need to adapt if we're to have a more efficient and a pacier civil service. But we're in a world that's changing ever faster, and we're working with ever fewer resources. So we need to do things more quickly and more cheaply. We need to be more robust about the way we work. Less insistence, perhaps, on always being able to show to the nth degree how you reached a conclusion. No more assumption that every action must be presaged with a strategy paper and analysis of every possible permutation and outcome. More willingness to try new things. No more, it may work in theory, it may work in practice, but it won't work in theory. A recognition that the best organizations learn more from the things that are tried and don't work than they do from the things that do work. Not every failure is a culpable failure. We don't have to have a scapegoat for everything that doesn't work. As I say, the best organizations learn more from the things that are tried. They don't work, you stop doing it, learn from it, and encourage people to try new things. We still have a culture where you can preside over an inefficient status quo with impunity, but try something new that might improve things, but doesn't, and it's never forgotten. So we need a relentless focus on outcomes, not on process and procedure. More willingness to accept that something that delivers 80% of the solution in 20% of the time and for 20% of the cost, this may be worth having. And this is mostly about expectations, about culture and behavior. I don't claim to know how all this gets to happen. We'll need to mobilize some of the best and most experienced operators from inside and outside Whitehall to help us to deliver it. But there are some practical things that can help. Co-location of different departments in the way that I've described, working more closely together in modern open spaces where rapid interaction is the order of the day. This can help. Common ICT platforms, enabling people from different departments to move seamlessly between roles. This can help to break down the silos that often anchor us in bureaucratic paralysis. And such changes to expectations and culture and behavior will make transition between the sectors less challenging too. For people entering the civil service from the private sector and vice versa, people entering the private sector from the civil service, they can experience culture shock so severe as to be occasionally terminal. Tissue rejection is still too frequent, despite the welcome fact that more appointments these days are made externally. And we should want and welcome that interchange. So both ways, really important. Fifth, we need, I think, equal status for civil servants who come through the operational delivery, the management, the financial and commercial streams. And this has been talked about for decades. I referred earlier to the Fulton report where he made exactly that point, but it's never really, I think, been delivered. I look today at the civil service as a minister, and I see a service class-riven, white collar, blue collar. Yes, we rightly insist that no one can occupy a top job without some serious management exposure. But it remains the case that departmental permanent secretaries are overwhelmingly drawn from the ranks of policy officials. And nowhere else would this be the case. In no other big budget environment would you expect there never to be a top executive drawn from the finance or commercial streams. Nowhere else would strategy and policy consistently trump operational delivery in the competition for the top slots. And this must over time change. It's not overnight by any means. Ministers need to forego their apparent insistence on having policy experts as permanent secretaries. There must at some stage come a time when at least as many permanent secretary slots are filled from outside the policy stream as from within it. Then we'll genuinely have what has been talked about for so long, genuine parity of esteem. And we really need to look for that. Sixth, and very much related to the last, we need a massive upgrading in project, program, and contract management skills. There are people with brilliant project management skills in the civil service, but not enough. And these skills are not nearly consistently enough instilled through the service. So that's why we'll be setting up a new project management academy. We're learning from some of the most successful organizations in the world. There's nothing new about this. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. Neither is it especially glamorous, but it's really important, and we'll do it. In the Public Services White Paper, we'll be setting out how the coalition government is going to push forward the diversification of public service provision. Commissioning from diverse providers means procurement and contract management will increasingly replace hierarchical line management. And we shouldn't just assume that these skills are inbuilt, that people can just migrate seamlessly from being a line manager to a contract manager. These skills need to be learned, and we'll ensure that they can be. Seventh, professional and commercial streams need to be strengthened and given more clout and status. One of the great advances since I was last in government is that these roles are no longer filled by clever generalists doing a stint in finance or HR before returning to their first love, policy. We have strong cadres today of highly qualified, tough-minded professionals with the skills that big organizations need. So what you may ask is the beef. It is that they're still not always given the clout and authority that they would have in private sector organizations. In an Institute for Government study early last year, a Whitehall finance director was quoted anonymously as saying that he felt like a scorekeeper, not like a player. And yet, in most private sector organizations, the chief financial officer, the CFO, will be typically be the second most senior executive in the organization. Well, we need the same rebalancing within the civil service, the same uplift in clout and status for HR, finance, CIOs, and commercial directors. Eighth, there must be more rigorous, and I mentioned this earlier, more rigorous performance management. We've already started down this path. And no, this isn't about saying that the civil service is stuffed with idle good-for-nothings who should be fired. It hasn't been right in either direction, actually. The stars should be able to rise faster. There should be a reward for those talented individuals who deliver real change against the odds. And a flatter and less hierarchical service will make this easier to achieve. And there are poor performers. I hear this wherever I go. Poor performers who get overlooked and tolerated. This is deeply demotivating and demoralizing for the hard-working, dedicated majority who see the reputation of the whole being pulled down by the few. And again, this isn't to say that they should all be somehow summarily fired. This first step is to recognize underperformance and to communicate it. The next is to support the underperformer to improve. Exit is the last resort. But in that last resort, it does need to happen, and it needs to happen on terms that are fair to everyone. The civil service is not by any means the only organization where these tough conversations are often avoided. But for a modern, pacey, fast-moving service fit for the future, we can't carry on like we have in the past. Now, a word about mutuals. I deeply believe that public service mutuals, employee-led and owned, can be a big part of the future. This isn't a cloak for privatization. It's the idea that public sector staff should be able to spin themselves off from their parent bodies by turning themselves into enterprises with an ownership stake, maybe complete, maybe partial, for their employees. Some will do so with the help of private sector joint venture partners. Others will go it alone. Some will be not-for-profit, others fully commercial. The benefits are less bureaucracy, better access to outside expertise and capital, and the huge boosts in productivity and morale that come with employee ownership. Last November, local partnerships set up a mutuals information service to act as first port of call for groups wanting to explore this option. Since its launch, it's received around 250 inquiries, many of them from employees providing public services as part of local authorities across the country. But there's been a lot in the health sector, social care, and some from central government. There's absolutely no reason why this movement shouldn't spread more in the civil service, and we welcome expressions of interest. And we have a small team working in the Cabinet Office supporting groups who are interested in doing that. To conclude, let me say again why I'm so committed to reform. For me, as I say, one of the great pleasures being back in government is having the chance to work alongside so many dedicated officials with the same public service ethos that I admired so much when I was in government before. Many of them could have chosen on leaving university, starting work, to earn a fat salary at a bank, to join the graduate trainee program of this or that multinational, or indeed to start climbing the greasy pole into politics, although I wouldn't recommend that. Instead, they chose to become civil servants, not because they expected to get rich doing it, certainly not because they might get some letters after their name or even before their name in 30 years' time, but because the work's interesting, yes, because if you're in Whitehall, being part of the bustle, being in the loop of the news of the day, that can be exciting, but most of all, quite simply because it matters, because they quietly know that they're helping make the country a better place. And that applies as much to the hundreds of thousands making job centres and revenue offices function, who keep the borders open and secure, and who unobtrusively make 1,001 crucial public services function. These are the passionate, hard-working, dedicated people with a public service vocation who keep the public services going. I want our civil service not only to continue to be among the very best in the world, but to be better and better, to march into the future full of hope and aspiration and excitement and ambition, because that's the civil service that I love and that I'm proud to be the Minister for. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Minister. Now we have time for questions. We've got roving mics here. Normal rules, if you could say your name and organisation, that would be very helpful. The gentleman here in the front, I'll try and take 2 or 3 questions at once because the time is limited. So, person with a mic, could you come down here to about the 3rd or 4th row, please? Gentleman there. Do we have anyone on this side? Lady at the front here. It's the second, and keep putting your hands up if you want to. You fire away.
Graham Henderson, Department of Health, and also former president of Prospect, the specialist union, and always an eminently reasonable trade union.
Absolutely.
There is much what you said, Mr. Mort, which I'm sure my union would work with you on, and particularly in terms of the internal aspects of the civil service. But given the 2-year pay freeze, which is likely to reduce civil service salaries by 10% or so, increased pension contributions, reduced pension benefits, including much longer time until you actually receive them, and job losses, quite large job losses, isn't the government in danger of creating the perfect storm?
Okay, thank you. Another question over here.
Thank you,
Siobhan. Could you give the mic?
Siobhan Benita from the Department of Health. I'd just like to pick up on what you said, Minister, about changing the culture in the civil service and about us needing to be taking more risks and being pacier, which I completely agree with. But I think the reason why we aren't all of those things at the moment is because we don't want to get our ministers into trouble. So we're worried about doing that.
They're quite capable of doing that on their own, I can tell you.
Well, I've never in 15 years had a minister ever say, I'm prepared to take a risk and I won't turn around and look for somebody to blame. So I'm just interested in how much effort is going into changing the culture of ministers alongside changing the culture of officials.
That's a really good question.
Good question. Can we have one more? Hands up, please. One more. One at the back there, yes? One over there. Okay, there's one at the back first. Let's try and whiz up there. And then you can come in the next cluster of 3, okay?
Good afternoon, Sir Francis Maud. My name's Carol. I work for Job Centre Plus in West Yorkshire. I was just wondering, in regards to the changes and the reform agenda, have you gone out to discuss with the local communities? Because obviously it would also be affecting them. So although you're wanting to change the department, do you think that you should be also consulting the actual community to find out what they want? Because obviously it's about localism as well.
3 very good questions. Are we creating a perfect storm? Well, kind of, we are in a storm. You know, we've got a massive budget deficit. The perfect storm, actually, would be to have a massive budget deficit and not deal with it. Greece is kind of in a perfect storm. Big budget deficit, same as ours, not dealing with it. Interest rates, 4 times ours, nearly 5 times our interest rates. We got interest rates at the same level as Germany, despite a budget deficit at the same level as Greece. And that's because we are doing the tough things. A lot of people, as I say, took pay cuts in the private sector recession. We're now in a public sector recession, and we have to be. We're in order to deal with the downturn. I want us to be able to protect jobs in the public sector the best we can. And to say the arithmetic's very simple. The more each job costs, and that's about pay, about the cost of pensions, the fewer jobs there'll be. So is it a perfect storm? It's stormy, for sure. I don't pretend otherwise. And that's why I want us at the same time to be setting out and really pushing for a civil service reformed in a way that does meet the ambitions and aspirations of its members. And that does actually involve responding to what communities themselves need. And you know, to pick up your question from the back, in organizations like Job Centre Plus, which are kind of absolutely interfacing with the local community, and we need to be freeing people up more to configure the services they provide around the needs of their communities. You know, the old idea that we are a terribly centralized country still, much more so than any other. And the idea that you can set out precisely from a desk in Whitehall how things should be delivered, services should be delivered in every single part of the country with massively different communities is unrealistic. And so freeing people up to be able to respond, to adapt, configure the services they provide around the needs of their communities, I think that's really important. And your point, I think is a really good point. And I made the point actually in that section where I was talking about the change in the culture. We do need to change expectations among ministers in Parliament and the media. And the point you raise about risk is very interesting and important. I think we've had a bit of a tendency, and politicians are absolutely, as much as anyone, if not more, to blame for this, to pile up macro risk, to pile policy risk on restructuring risk, on financial risk, on technology risk, in a way that it multiplies the risk. One of the constraints I think there'll be on that is the new boards we've set up, the stronger departmental boards with a strong risk and audit committee who will be looking at the risk map and will actually be able to blow the whistle if they think the risk is piling up too much, too high. I think that will be a constraint. But I think we get it wrong, you see. I think we're too ready to take huge risk, and we're not ready enough to take sort of working level micro risk. And you know, I meant what I said. The best organizations know that you learn at least as much, if not more, from the things that are tried that don't work. And you need to have a culture that says, okay, we tried that, we stopped doing it as soon as we knew it didn't work, and actually far too often we start doing things that don't work, and yet we carry on doing them. We're not very good at pulling the plug on them and saying, okay, tried that, didn't work, what are we learning from it? Because there's always got to be a scapegoat. And we don't, trying things that don't work isn't the end of the world. I've said to the PAC and to the head of the National Audit Office, I know that what you will always tend to do is put a spotlight on failures and pillory them is maybe not actually going that far. And I know that you sometimes try and highlight successes, but actually sometimes you just need to look at things that haven't worked, but which were nonetheless the right thing to try, and say that was the right decision. It was a well-informed decision. You looked at the risk, you decided it was worth trying, and you stopped doing it as soon as it was clear it wasn't working. Because actually that's what good organizations do. And and you're quite right to say, ministers' expectations are a big part of that. But the media has a big part to play in that as well. Thank
you, Minister. We've got time for one more cluster of three. So, gentlemen there, can I see for the other two? Far away, please.
Right. Hello, Simon Young, Driving Standards Agency. I'm interested in the way you describe the commercialisation of the civil service. You obviously have in mind becoming more commercial, maybe getting income from commercialising what we have. I'm interested in what the limits are of where you're prepared to go on that. I'm thinking, for example, at the extreme product placement, things like that. Interested in your views on that one, please.
Okay, product placement. Gentleman at the front.
Thank you. You talked a lot about cutting costs, and we see a lot of payments that are made by the government to individuals, to organisations that shouldn't be paid. I'm talking about fraudulent claims, I'm talking about evasion. We see the NAO figures of billions of pounds being paid out incorrectly. I'm just wondering from a macro level if there's a government-wide strategy to look at that.
Okay. Thank you. And you've got the last question.
Hi, Lynn MacDonald, Tell Us Once. I'm wondering about changing the culture from the outside in. So while we're doing loads of things around SMEs and trying to break down the procurement, how about just opening up the civil service so that people can deliver services in? Because one of the things we do is control and then security, and we stop it. And actually there's loads of innovation out there that we could just be accepting and not having to do it ourselves. Let them fail and try it, and we accept it.
Great.
Just on that, I completely agree. One of the things that Martha Lane Fox recommended in her report when she looked at direct gov and all of that territory, where she created this great idea of digital by default. Actually, we should look to be doing public services that can be delivered online. Obviously, that isn't all of them. We should aim to do them only, provide them only online, with a trajectory to get there, not overnight. And one of the things she said was that we should, and I kind of get a bit lost in the technicalities of it here, but we should be much more open to others providing applications. APIs, have I got that right? Good. Tick. And I think that's absolutely right. We need to be much more open. And Mike Bracken, who's starting tomorrow, I think, as the new head of the Government Digital Service, he'll have responsibility for driving this forward. And I'm delighted he's joining us. He's absolutely kind of top of the tree in this territory. And I hope he won't mind me saying he's coming to work for the government for a lot less money than he could have gone and worked for outside, because he saw it as a great opportunity to do some serious serious changes on a big canvas. And great that we've got him. Your point on fraud and error. It was Harold Wilson who said, I'm glad you asked that question. And it cues me up nicely. I set up at the Prime Minister's request last autumn a cross-government task force, which I chair, on fraud and error. Because actually it seemed to us that there was too many things going on in different places. And actually a lot of the work you can do to cut out fraud and error. And again, I talk about the work we're doing cutting overhead. fraud and error is a completely unnecessary loss of taxpayers' money. And it's the National Fraud Authority says £21 billion lost just in fraud across the public sector. There's a lot more unquantified, except in DWP, who do quantify in error. Quite a lot of uncollected debt. And a lot of the same capabilities and technologies can be deployed across the piece, and we need to buy them, data analytics, for example, buy them much more cohesively. And again, rather than embark on creating a great sort of strategy and white paper and so on, we decided the thing to is do things. I have a weakness for wanting to do stuff. And we launched some pilots, and they've been really illuminating. I mean, the Revenue did a pilot on suspected living together fraud, people who were claiming tax credit as a single person when they were actually evidence suggests they might be living with cohabiting. Did a quick sample of data analytics, found 750 people who were high risk of living together, conducting this fraud, wrote letters to 750 people. As a result, half of them, without any follow-up at all, stopped claiming, with an annualized saving just from that tiny pilot of £1.5 million a year. Now, roll that out much more widely, and you've got big savings. And I don't know whether those people were fraudulent or whether it was a mistake, they didn't know, and actually it matters whether it was fraud or error, but it's a bit second order. My concern is to stop the money going out to people who shouldn't be getting it, because that's money that's needed to help vulnerable people who do depend on it. So I think looking at this across the piece is really, really important. And there's a whole lot of other pilots where actually you find, you know that those people, there's a reasonable chance they'll also be claiming single-person discount in council tax as well. So kind of get the information out there. And there's money to be saved in places where we ought to be saving money. There's no excuse for us not being quite rigorous about this, and we will be. And your point about potential, I haven't thought about product placement, but noted. I don't actually think that's where we're going to go. When I talk about strengthening the commercial streams, I really mean that we need to take more seriously how we procure. And I've talked about how we will in future be aggregating procurement of commodity goods and services, so that we use the volume that the central government can buy to drive down cost and price. That we increasingly, when we negotiate with the biggest suppliers, we will act as a whole of government, not as individuals. So last summer we said to all the big suppliers, you think you've got 27 different customers, you now got one. It's called the Crown, and for these purposes it's me. And we're your biggest customer. For most of them, we're your biggest customer. And we expect pricing that reflects that. So again, we can drive down the cost and spend the money where we want it spent, in frontline services, supporting the people who need those services. So I'm probably not product placement quite yet, but who knows?
Well, Minister, thank you very much. I mean, you've been both, you've demonstrated, I think, that you actually strongly believe in the values of the civil service, but you're also at the same time challenging us to do better. I'm slightly pleased I won't turn out to be the McDonald's cabinet secretary, brought to you. But I think what we've had there is some ideas of innovation. People want to actually deliver better for less, and some of the ideas you've thrown out for us really challenge us, and I think it's up to us to respond and show how we can really get back to this, and power to your elbow with the NAO, the PAC, and of course, most of all, the Treasury and getting those booking rooms. That's something else. So let's hear it for the Minister. Thank you.
Thanks very much.